Hello the world, hello the internet, hello people interested in the judiciary in the UK, and hello to Jason Isaacs at the back. This is one of the first presentations I've done directly for the new Edexcel specification, and the reason why I've done that is because obviously the specification has changed, and in that capacity there's good news, more good news, and then perhaps some slightly, well, not news at all. The good news is that you have to go into a much less deep dive into the judiciary in the UK than you had to previously, and I know this has been a problem for some people. This course, this aspect of the course in particular, has been very, very tricky. But now you don't need to do the same level of detail that once upon a time you were obliged to. The other bit of good news is that you can now draw direct points of contrast between the way in which the courts operate in the UK and the way in which the courts operate in the United States. And though it may not seem immediately obvious right now, that is going to make life an awful lot easier as you go downstream. I suppose the not news is that this is still a tricky aspect of the course, but it's certainly a whole lot simpler than it used to be, and I'll see what I can do to make it simpler still. So we start at the beginning with an overview of the UK judicial system, and this is an overview. And as I said, this is a much less deep dive than we used to have to do, and what I'm presenting now is a very simplified picture of the UK judicial system. So don't write in and tell me that I've grossly simplified it. I know I have. This is all you need to know for the politics Edexcel course. You need to know an awful lot more if you're doing a law A-level, of course, but this is going to do for us right now. So we start at the top with the Supreme Court, and as the name suggests, this is the highest court in the land. Once upon a time, that used to be the House of Lords, sitting as the court of final appeal. But in 2005, the Labour government passed the Constitutional Reform Act, and one of its provisions was the creation of a Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court came into effect from 2008, and it has sat thus ever since. Now, the Supreme Court sits at the top of our judicial system, and in that sense it represents the confluence, or it sits at the confluence of the two different streams of justice, one of which is the criminal court system, and that works thus. So you will start perhaps in the magistrates' court, then your case might progress to the Crown Court, through the Court of Appeal, and then to the Supreme Court. Similarly, in the civil stream, you have county courts, which leads to the High Court of Justice, through the Court of Appeal, civil, and then to the Supreme Court. Again, just to point out the difference there, and it's not an exact corollary, but here we've got the Justice there. That's the top of the Old Bailey, which is just around the corner from St Paul's in London. And then at the other end of the Strand, you've got the RCJ, the Royal Courts of Justice. Well, not the other end of Fleet Street, excuse me. You've got the RCJ sitting there in all their Gothic splendour. So those are the two streams of the judicial system in the UK, and they both come together at the Supreme Court level. Okay, so what is it then that the judiciary do in the UK? Well, in the first instance, their job is to uphold the will of Parliament. This means that when a law is broken, they sit in arbitration of that law, decide if there is an allegation, that the law has been broken, they will sit in arbitration of that law and exercise and fulfill justice to see whether or not the courts that law has indeed been broken and what action should follow. They then exercise judicial review, and this is checking the activity of the state. Is the state acting lawfully? Is the state acting properly? I'll go into this in a little more detail, indeed in a deep dive in a future presentation. They are there also to enforce and observe the rule of law and the operation of law. Again, I'll deal with that in the next slide, actually, as I will with natural justice. So just going through those again, the will of Parliament is, of course, legislation, and so the job of the courts is to protect parliamentary legislation, and where, pardon me, there is an allegation that parliamentary legislation has been breached, then they will hear that particular case and act accordingly. Judicial review, as I said, is an assessment of state action. It asks whether or not the state has exceeded its authority, and indeed in that action, has it acted properly? Has it acted within the rules? So that's judicial review. Again, we've got a deep dive on that coming up in a future presentation, so we can move on from there for the time being. The rule of law, there are all sorts of ways of looking at the rule of law, but the way I like is, I think, a simple way, and it is very, very simply that all laws apply to all people at all times and all in the same way. So in other words, nobody is above the law, and yes, you can write in and tell me that at certain times the Queen can't do this, the Queen can't do that, and yes, judges themselves can't be held accountable for what they, they can't be charged with defamation or things like that for things they say in court, but that's a separate issue. Let's just deal with the rule of law, and it basically says that all laws apply to all people at all times and all in the same way, and move on from that. Natural justice is the law, and its application should be fair, and again, we'll sort of deal with that as we go through the rest of the presentation. Okay. So coming back to the Supreme Court, here they, whoops, they've gone too far there. Coming back to the Supreme Court, there they are. There are 12 of them. And sitting at the chair is the president of the court, and that's Lady Brenda Hale. Now, on one hand, that's tremendous news. It's wonderful. We have the first female president of the court, and it's about bloody time. So that's really, really good. It's really, really bad, on the other hand, because up to this point, we've had some really cool judge names. We had Judge, we had Judge Laws. We've had some really good nominative determinism working there. Lady Brenda Hale, wonderful, very, very bright person. But unfortunately, nominative determinism seems to have broken down there. Anyway, I'm just being flip, and we should probably move on. How do you get there? Well, you become a Supreme Court judge by being extremely experienced and very, very good at your job. All judges have to be neutral. You can't be biased. You have to be impartial. And these are very, very important principles, as is the idea that they should be independent. They should be able to act without fear or favor from anybody else at all. So neutrality and independence, these are necessary conditions of those two things I mentioned earlier, that is the rule of law and of natural justice. I go into an awful lot of detail on both of these in separate presentations, and I shall link off to those in the notes from this particular video. Okay. In essence, however, judicial neutrality is the idea that the judicial function should operate impartially, free from bias, or, if you like, justice does not take sides. That might seem a little bit odd. Surely justice is on the side of right and against wrong. Well, ideally, that would be nice. But as natural justice said, we should just try to be fair. Justice is about being fair, making sure that everybody has their time in court, and making sure that everybody's voice is heard. That's why guilty people, people who are accused of crimes get their defense counsel, just as the state will have the prosecution counsel. How do we achieve neutrality? Well, the appointment to the courts the appointment of judges has to be on the basis of merit rather than any other consideration. I'm thinking here, again, particularly political. And again, here, the contrast with the United States is going to become very, very interesting as we go on. Judges are appointed based on the recommendation of the Judicial Appointments Commission, and all cases in terms of how the courts operate are assessed impartially and free from any bias as far as is possible. Judges, and indeed anybody else, solicitors, barristers, members of the jury, they should recuse themselves. That is essentially said, we cannot be part of this if there is any case, if there is any chance that their impartiality might be compromised and thereby compromise the outcome of the court. And again, we're going to have a useful contrast with the Supreme Court of the United States, where judges are appointed because of their political views and are expected to behave a particular way once they get on the bench. That is not the case in the UK. In the United States, a president will nominate a justice, and that nomination may or may not be ratified by the Senate, but at all times what we're seeing here is a political system underway. In the United Kingdom, that is not the case, and judges are supposed to be neutral. We'll come to independence later. So here we have a lovely little quote from Lord Devlin. You can pause and read that yourself. But it does that lovely idea there that justice does not take sides, and the judge who loses the appearance of impartiality is halfway towards becoming himself or herself impartial. Here's a very, very good example of that very idea. Pinochet was a dictator. He was in control of Chile through the 70s into the 80s, and a lot of people wanted to see him in court. In 1999, he stopped in the UK on way to get some medical treatment, and he was promptly arrested. And in the case of that trial, he was found it was found that he could be extradited to Spain for crimes committed against Spanish nationals while he had been in charge of Chile. The key point here is that one of the judges who was sitting on that particular bench had close ties to Amnesty International, and Amnesty International were very, very keen to see Pinochet in court. And as soon as the defense team found that out, they said, well, okay, this is compromised. Lord Hoffman, of course, said, I'm not compromised in the slightest, but the very fact that he might have been compromised led to the collapse of the trial, and the decision didn't stand, and Pinochet escaped extradition on that occasion. So it's not enough to be neutral, you have to be seen to be neutral, and again, come back to that idea that judges should recuse themselves if there is any sort of conflict of interest there at all. Judicial independence is related to that, but it is slightly different. Justice does not take orders from anybody. The judicial function should be free of any improper influence. Well, what does that mean? That means it should be free from, well, you can read that. This is all linked off on this particular page here. This is a really, really good page. And there it is. It is all about, it's coming up any time now. Really, really good little bit there about the courts, the tribunals and judiciary. I will link off to that at the back of this particular presentation. So, judicial independence means that no one gets to mess with the process of justice. No one can seek to influence a decision. No one can overturn or reject a decision. Decisions can be challenged, but only through the appeals process. With the court cases ongoing, everybody has to shut up about it. Judges can't be sacked for their decisions. They can only be sacked for gross misconduct. Only one judge has been sacked in the last 100 years. And they can't be challenged on account of their decisions. Appointment, as we mentioned earlier, is by the Judicial Appointments Commission, and salaries are fixed by independent tribunals. And by convention, judges shut up about politics and politicians should shut up about law. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And here's an example. In the Brexit case of 2017, the Supreme Court rejected the government's claim that it could trigger Brexit without a vote in Parliament. And here's a lovely quote from Lord Neuberger at the time. The government in the Daily Mail was not happy. You might remember there were headlines along the lines of enemies of the people, blah, 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 blah. And the Daily Mail got into big trouble for that. They should not have done that at all. And they were forced to issue an apology. There are limits, on the other hand, to the neutrality. Demographics, they overwhelmingly tend to be male, pale and frail, and that page that I directed you to earlier has some very, very good data on the back of that. And the exercise of judicial review is always tinged a little bit with politics, and so we have to be very, very careful when we're operating on that front. And there are some specific appointments in the judiciary that are political. The Attorney General, who sits at Cabinet, he is a political appointment, and the Solicitor General is also a political appointment. But here we're getting into a deep dive, and I can't really see any situation where you would need to go into that in an A-level exam. There is still some government involvement in appointment, and the Attorney General does superintend the Crown Prosecution Service. But again, that's a deep dive that was relevant previously, but I'm not sure it's going to be entirely relevant as we go into the next one. What's much more important is that there is an obligation on the courts to uphold the will of Parliament. The courts should try to review legislation, and we'll come to that later, such that it is compatible with the will of Parliament, particularly with previously enacted parliamentary statutes. That probably sounds quite complicated, and it is, but I will explain that as we go on in a later presentation. Constitutional review is what I'm sort of trying to get around to. Constitutional review is not available to judges in the UK. The UK judges cannot use the Constitution by which to judge laws. They can only use laws by which to judge laws if they're looking for compatibility. Again, complicated issue that we will deal with in more detail in a later presentation. And again, the contrast there with the Supreme Court of the United States is going to be extremely useful. The main idea with this whole thing about judicial independence is that it doesn't matter who the judge is. If you've got an independent judiciary, if you've got a neutral judiciary, then ideally what you should be able to do is change the judge and get the same verdict. That is the critical idea, that justice should not depend on the actual judge who is sitting there. You could take any one of those judges, use them in your case and get the same answer if judges are neutral and they are independent. And if that's working, then it means that the process is working. And if the process is working, then the process is fair. and then the rule of law is being upheld, and natural justice is being upheld, and that means that the courts are working. Lots of complicated ideas there. I look forward to discussing them in class. Bring me your questions, and I'll answer them as best I can. Good luck.